The constant seeking of pleasure is the reason we're all so miserable. Or even not just miserable, we're also kind of bored and we're always like in this wanting state. Like we're never quite satisfied, we're never happy. And there's a good reason for this, and that's because pleasure and pain work like a seesaw mechanism in the brain. So, in order to have pleasure, you do actually need pain. And I don't mean this in like a weird way. What I mean is that you need to go through some type of suffering. And so, in this world that we live in now, we have this like worship of just seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. We want distraction. We want everything now. We have built entire economies on basically seeking pleasure. And the problem with this is that now, since we're trying to avoid pain at all cost, avoid suffering at all cost, and we've stopped normalizing suffering, which is another issue. So historically, we would have some type of way of normalizing suffering, whether that would be through Stoicism, like the ancients, or it would be through religions in which we thought that there was a point to our suffering. We now have stopped wanting suffering, we've stopped accepting it, and we've stopped being okay with it. And so now a lot of us feel like if I'm suffering emotionally, then I'm doing something wrong. There's something wrong with me. Like I'm not as good as the happy people, even though, let me tell you, as someone that talks to a lot of people, none of us are quite as happy as we pretend to be. The thing is that with this kind of downfall of suffering historically, and with this chasing of pleasure that we now engage in, where we're consuming constant content that's telling us we need to feel good, we need to take care of ourselves, we need to rest, which I'm not against resting, but this constant bombardment that we have of pleasure is ruining our minds. And it's making us utterly miserable, because the more that we engage in pleasurable activities, whether it's distractions, whether it's just eating really nice food, whatever, the more adapted we get to pleasure. So it's kind of this hedonic treadmill of pleasure. And the more difficult it is for us to actually feel good. So we essentially go into something called anhedonia, which is the inability of feeling pleasure and joy. And anhedonia, you might be aware of what it feels like. It's kind of just this like living life on kind of this like meh. Like you don't really feel much. You're just like whatever. Everything kind of feels a little bit boring. Like it just doesn't, things don't interest you. Like you don't get excited. Like you're not really kind of going between any type of real emotion. You kind of just feel like everything's lackluster. That's anhedonia. And this is because we're engaging in too much pleasure and we're essentially living our lives chasing pleasure. And so if we actually want to feel better, we need to normalize suffering again. And I mean like good suffering, not like suffering for no point, in that we're suffering to achieve something. We're suffering for a purpose. And we need to also normalize the fact that we kind of all suffer. Like it's very normal. And that the suffering occurs for a reason. And it's actually really, really important, because it's the flip side of that neuronal circuit that regulates pleasure and pain. And so in order to have pleasure, we do need to essentially complete some type of work. And this work is where we're suffering. And so if we engage in work, suffering, that then results in pleasure, then this mechanism stays healthy. But if we just kind of live our lives in the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, then we go into anhedonia, where we're not really feeling much, like we're feeling just kind of bored with life. And so I know this isn't necessarily going to be a popular video, but this is one of the reasons we're seeing so much of a mental health crisis. We're seeing just so many people like feeling like life isn't quite what it could be. And if this is you, I encourage you to schedule an intro session, link in the bio, because you don't have to live like this. Like you don't have to live with kind of this sense like you're not really like getting much out of life. This can be regulated. It's just that we don't really have good ways of doing it in the popular culture now because of this relationship between pain and pleasure that we've kind of ruined for ourselves.